Greetings and welcome to the pre-concert video for French Winds. Now, as much as that title suggests a warm breeze while lying on the beach on the French Riviera, which is something that I'm pretty sure we could all use right now, this is actually, as you probably figured out, it's a program of music for wind instruments by French composers. Now, this airs on March the 4th. There are 3 works on this program, and surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, they're quite contrasting in their compositional styles, even though they only span 50 years, exactly 50 years in fact. The earliest work is the Petite Symphonie for winds by Gounod, and it's from 1885. The latest work, chronologically, is the Suite Française by Poulenc, and it's from 1935. So only 50 years apart, and they sound very, very different. Now, the middle work, chronologically speaking again, is the Dukas Fanfare, and that dates from 1912. I'm going to start with that one since it's first on the program. So, Paul Dukas, this is what he looked like. And yes, you do pronounce the S on the end of his name, even though that sort of goes against what you instinctually think of with the French language. Paul Dukas. He's not a composer who gets played a lot, which is really unfortunate. The only 2 works that the Victoria Symphony has ever performed by Dukas are this fanfare and his most performed work, the tone poem L'Apprenti Sorcier, which is, of course, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. It was made famous by Walt Disney in the film Fantasia. You can pretty much ensure your musical immortality if your work is made into a cartoon starring Mickey Mouse. Now, part of the reason that we perform so little Dukas is that he published very little music, only about 15 works in his lifetime, and only about 3 or 4 large-scale orchestral works, 1 opera, 1 ballet. He was a relentless perfectionist, and he only allowed 15 of his works to be published during his lifetime. Unfortunate for us. Now, our brass section, including yours truly, is performing a fanfare by Dukas subtitled Pour précéder la Péri. Now, la Péri was Dukas' only ballet. Péri, or Péri, it's actually an English word too, is a mythological superhuman being of great beauty. Now, the best analog would be a fairy or a genie. Now, if you know your Gilbert and Sullivan, the operetta Iolanthe is subtitled The Peer and the Péri. Iolanthe is a Péri. Now, the concept of the Péri comes from Persian mythology, and the Dukas ballet's central character is Ixander, which is the Persian name of Alexander the Great. Now, he tries to steal the flower of immortality from the Péri, who guards it on the steps of the temple of the supreme Zoroastrian deity Ormuzd, or Ahura Mazda. I won't spoil the rest of the plot. Now, most ballets and operas begin with an overture, but Dukas decided to begin this ballet with a fanfare. Now, fanfares, of course, are usually used to announce things, important events, or the arrival of important people. So perhaps this fanfare was meant to introduce Ixander's character. I don't know. I could not find any audiovisual recordings of the original ballet anywhere. Not for sale or not on YouTube. There are lots of audio-only recordings, but there are no recordings that I can find of the staged ballet. There is a lovely version on YouTube that involves a lot of multimedia and some dancers, but it doesn't follow the original storyline. So there's a future project for you. We got to stage this ballet because the music is gorgeous. It's beautifully orchestrated, and it has all the richness of the large works of Debussy and Ravel, with a little bit of Respighi thrown in. Now, this fanfare is really short, but it has 4 sections. The first 2 are very similar. They're just in different keys, and there's a brief middle section that leads to a recap. So the form is basically intro, A prime, B, A. Now, the way he ends each of these A sections is really, really curious, and I've been really nerding out over this. Most composers end a section of a work with a device we call a cadence. A cadence is a chord sequence, and it usually ends with a pretty final sounding chord, like this. Now, what Dukas does with the end of each of the A sections in this fanfare is he lands on not one, but three big chords. Now, the first is a good arrival point, but then he moves to a very dissonant chord, and then finally to another consonant chord that's very harmonically distant from the first chord. I'll show you with a couple of examples. Here's the end of the first A section. And here's the end of the second A section. The middle chord is even more dissonant this time. Now, if you read music, you probably noticed that chords 1 and 3 in each of those examples, the nice major chords, happen to be a tritone apart. Now, remember my past videos where I talked about that interval? It used to be called the devil's interval. Anyway, there's lots to geek out over in Dukas's music, and he's definitely an underrated composer. So moving on, the second work features our stellar woodwind section with the addition of two horns. The horns are those cool kids who get invited to everybody's party. Both woodwind and brass ensembles lay claim to the horns. This is Charles Gounod, a very, very important figure in 19th century French music. He's very famous for both liturgical music and opera, especially his operas Faust and Romeo and Juliet. And since I made a pop culture reference about Dukas, I will make one here. What music do you hear in your head when I show you this image? Bum, 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 bum. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's Gounod's Funeral March of a Marionette. Of course, used as the theme for the opening sequence of Alfred Hitchcock's TV series. You might be too young to remember that. I certainly am. Now, Gounod had international influences as a composer, among them Felix Mendelssohn, and you very much hear this classical, I'm going to put that in air quotes, classical side in his music. Now, one of the themes that I use a lot in these talks is Beethoven was a sort of a fork in the road for music history. A lane of composers after him kept working within the classic forms, sonata form, very tidy themes, very symmetrical presentation of the music. You get composers like Mendelssohn in this lane. I'm going to call them the rule followers. And the other lane went to the rule breakers, the people who broke away from all that. You get composers like Berlioz, Wagner in this lane. Now, Gounod was definitely in the classical lane. At least in this piece, it's quite evident. Interestingly, in the decade before this piece, the Petite Symphonie, was written, Gounod spent a few years in England. And I can't help but thinking that another student of Mendelssohn, another Mendelssohn scholar, and since I just mentioned Iolanthe in this talk, it's pretty hard to listen to this excerpt from the Petite Symphonie for winds and not be reminded at least a little of Sir Arthur Sullivan. Now, incidentally, if you want some really juicy reading, you should read about Gounod's relationship with the English singer and actress Georgina Weldon. There is a bit of tabloid-style dramatics there. Well worth digging into. So moving on to the final piece by this monsieur. This is Francis Poulenc. And as I just stated earlier, music branched off a lot in the 19th century. And it really culminated in the early part of the 20th century when all of a sudden all bets were off. Composers had pushed the limit of any kind of formal conventions around music. And it eventually led to a system that abandoned the concept of tonality altogether. The concept of music being constrained by the relationships within certain scales, chords, the movement of voices, etc. Now in France, there was a movement to bring back the simplicity of earlier forms of music and to shed off the rather thick, complex forms that had grown up and come of age in the Romantic period. And one of the leaders in that movement was the French composer Eric Satie. Now, you probably know Satie for these very simple, and I mean simple in the most positive sense of the word, piano pieces called his Gymnopédie. Now, Satie assembled a group of composers around him that he would mentor into this new style, and he called them les six, the six. Poulenc was one of these six composers. He was a perfect candidate for this group as he was largely self-taught as a composer, which probably gave him a better opportunity to find his own voice. Now, the Suite Française, remember I said this is from 1935, it belongs to a really interesting genre. It's a modern restyling of earlier music. In this case, it's very early music, one of the earliest publications of instrumental music, the Livre des Danseries of this guy here. This is Claude Gervais, a 16th century composer and one of the pioneers in the music publishing business. Now, I'm calling this a restyling rather than an arrangement of this music. Usually with an arrangement, the composer or the arranger tries to be true to the original, but Poulenc has definitely put his original modern stamp on this music. Here's one of the pieces as it likely would have been performed in the 16th century. Now, I say likely because in those days, publishers like Gervais didn't put a lot of specifics into the music, like what instruments should be playing this, which would be variable depending on what was available. And performers weren't strictly held to what was written on the page. They were given room to improvise. So this is what the Gervais might have sounded like originally. Now here's what Poulenc did with the same music. The instrumentation of the Poulenc is worth mentioning. He uses the double reeds, the oboes and bassoons, teamed up with the trumpets and the trombones, plus a lone percussionist and a harpsichord. That's an instrument that Poulenc helped to revive in the 20th century by writing modern music for it. The instrumentation is interesting in that it's probably the best choice for instruments that still have vestiges of their original sounds from the 16th century. The double reeds had their antecedents in instruments like the shawm or the dulcian, which would have been very popular for music like this. And the trumpets and trombones, of course, with their ancestors that I've talked about in past talks, the cornets and the sackbuts. So in that sense, Poulenc has tipped his hat at least a little to the 16th century. There are a lot of really good examples of 20th century composers restyling music like this. And the Victoria Symphony recently did a bunch of them, all on one program. The Ancient Airs and Dances of the Italian composer Ottorino Respighi, the Holberg Suite of Edvard Grieg, and we've even done that on this virtual season, and the Pulcinella Suite of Igor Stravinsky. These are all good examples of a 20th century composer retooling early music. So it's nice to add the Poulenc Suite Française to this list. A plug for a future concert coming to a computer screen near you. We will perform and record Poulenc's organ concerto at Christ Church Cathedral, where the cathedral's music director, Donald Hunt, as soloist, on the magnificent Helmut Wolff organ housed in the West Gallery of the Cathedral. So we have that to look forward to. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you all very soon.